Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift into peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey back to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, to the forests and rivers of the Ohio Valley, where one of North America's most remarkable leaders emerged during a time of tremendous upheaval and change. This is the story of Tecumseh, a Shawnee warrior, diplomat, and visionary who dedicated his life to uniting the indigenous peoples of North America against the relentless expansion of European American settlement. His name, which means shooting star or panther across the sky, would become synonymous with resistance, dignity, and the tragic struggle of Native American peoples to preserve their lands, cultures, and ways of life. In this episode, we will explore in careful detail the world into which Tecumseh was born, the formative experiences that shaped his character, his rise to prominence as a warrior and leader, his ambitious attempt to forge a Pan-Indian Confederacy, his pivotal role in the War of 1812, and the lasting impact of his vision on both Native American history and the broader story of North America. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us travel back to a time when the fate of nations hung in the balance, and one man's dream of unity captured the imagination of peoples across a continent. If you enjoy this video or learn something new, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. Chapter 1. The World of the Shawnee. To understand Tecumseh, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The Shawnee people, whose name derives from their own word Shawano or Shawanogi, meaning Southerners, were an Algonquian-speaking nation with a rich and complex history that stretched back centuries before European contact. The Shawnee were not a sedentary people tied to one particular place. Their history is one of migration and adaptation, of dispersal and regathering. Archaeological and oral historical evidence suggests that the Shawnee originated in the Ohio River Valley, a region of gentle hills, dense forests, and abundant waterways that provided everything a people could need for prosperity and survival. The Ohio Valley in the 18th century was a landscape of extraordinary natural wealth. The forests were filled with white oak, hickory, beech, and maple trees, some growing to tremendous heights and girths that would be almost unimaginable to modern observers. The undergrowth provided nuts, berries, and medicinal plants that the Shawnee had learned to identify and use over countless generations. The rivers and streams teemed with fish, from massive sturgeon to catfish, bass, and pike. The forests sheltered deer, elk, black bear, and wild turkey in such abundance that European visitors would later write in astonishment about the plenty they witnessed. The Shawnee lived in villages along rivers and streams, their homes constructed of bark and wooden frames in a style that could be erected quickly and abandoned when necessary, reflecting their semi-nomadic traditions. These villages were organized around clan structures, with the Shawnee people divided into 5 main divisions: the Chillicothe, Mekoshe, Pecowe, Kispoko, and Hathawakila. Each division had specific ceremonial and political responsibilities within the larger Shawnee nation. The Chillicothe and Mekoshe divisions typically provided political leadership and were responsible for matters of governance and diplomacy. The Pecowe maintained religious ceremonies and were keepers of important sacred traditions. The Kispoko division into which Tecumseh would be born, produced the war chiefs and warriors who defended the people and led military expeditions. The Hattawakella served various supporting roles within the community structure. This division of responsibility created a balanced society where power was distributed and specialized, preventing any one group from dominating all aspects of Shawnee life. Decisions of importance were made through council gatherings where chiefs, elders, and respected warriors would speak, debate, and seek consensus. Women, particularly elder women and clan mothers, held significant influence in these discussions, especially in matters relating to agriculture, domestic affairs, and the raising of children. The Shawnee cosmology understood the world as infused with spiritual power. They believed in a creator deity, often called the Great Spirit or Master of Life, along with a complex pantheon of lesser spirits associated with natural phenomena, animals, and places. Dreams and visions were taken very seriously as messages from the spiritual realm, and individuals who experienced powerful visions might gain significant prestige and influence within the community. Religious ceremonies marked the turning of seasons and important events in the agricultural and hunting cycles. The green corn ceremony, celebrated when the corn first ripened, was a time of thanksgiving, renewal, and the ceremonial kindling of new fires. The bread dance, held in the spring, celebrated rebirth and new growth. These ceremonies reinforced community bonds, transmitted cultural knowledge to younger generations, and maintained the reciprocal relationship between the Shawnee people and the spiritual forces they believed animated the natural world. By the early 18th century, however, the Shawnee world was already undergoing dramatic transformations. European colonization of the eastern seaboard had set in motion a cascade of changes that rippled westward across the continent. Indigenous nations were pushed from their traditional territories, creating conflicts over land and resources. European diseases, to which Native Americans had no immunity, swept through communities with devastating effect, sometimes killing half or more of a village's population in a single epidemic. European trade goods, particularly metal tools, cloth, guns, and alcohol, had begun to alter traditional economies and ways of life. While these goods offered certain advantages, they also created dependencies and disrupted traditional crafts and skills. The fur trade, driven by European demand for beaver pelts and deerskins, transformed hunting from a subsistence activity into a commercial enterprise, leading to the over-harvesting of game animals and increasing competition between different native groups. The Shawnee, like many indigenous peoples, found themselves caught between competing European powers. The French, who claimed the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions, generally pursued a policy of alliance and trade with native peoples, often intermarrying with indigenous communities and adopting certain native customs. The British, who controlled the eastern seaboard colonies, were more focused on agricultural settlement and land acquisition, which inevitably brought them into conflict with indigenous peoples whose territories they coveted. The mid-18th century saw a series of devastating conflicts known collectively as the French and Indian War in North America, though European historians call it the 7 Years' War. This conflict, which raged from 1754 to 1763, pitted France and its native allies against Britain and its native allies, with both sides committing tremendous resources and both native and European combatants suffering terrible casualties. The Shawnee, given their location in the Ohio Valley, and their trading relationships with the French, generally sided with France during this conflict. Shawnee warriors fought in numerous engagements, including the famous Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, where a combined force of French soldiers and native warriors ambushed and decisively defeated a larger British force under General Edward Braddock. The British victory in 1763, confirmed by the Treaty of Paris, had profound implications for the Shawnee and other nations of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions. France ceded its North American territories to Britain, and the native peoples who had been French allies suddenly found themselves facing a new and less friendly colonial power. The British, unlike the French, were less interested in trade partnerships and more interested in opening indigenous lands to settlement by colonists pushing westward from the coastal colonies. This post-war period saw the emergence of native resistance movements attempting to halt or reverse British expansion. The most significant of these was led by an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac, who in 1763 organized a confederation of Great Lakes and Ohio Valley nations in a coordinated uprising against British forts and settlements. The conflict, known as Pontiac's War, saw native forces capture several British forts and lay siege to others, demonstrating the continued military capability of indigenous peoples when they acted in concert. Though Pontiac's War ultimately failed to drive the British from the region, it did force the British government to issue the Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to restrict colonial settlement to areas east of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving the lands to the west for indigenous peoples. This proclamation, however, was largely ignored by colonists and colonial governments, and unauthorized settlements continued to spread westward into Shawnee territory. It was into this world of change, conflict, and uncertainty that Tecumseh would be born in approximately 1768, though some sources suggest 1770 or 1771. The exact date is uncertain, as the Shawnee did not keep written records in the European fashion, and the various accounts recorded later by European American observers differ in their details. What we do know is that Tecumseh was born in the Shawnee village of Old Pequot, located on the Mad River in what is now western Ohio. His father was Pucashinwa, a respected war chief of the Kispoko division, and his mother was Methoataske, who some accounts suggest may have been of Creek or Cherokee ancestry, though this detail remains uncertain. Tecumseh was not an only child. He had several siblings, including an older brother named Chief, who would play an important role in Tecumseh's early life and education as a warrior. He also had a younger brother named Lalawetika, who would later rename himself Tenskwatawa and become known as the Shawnee Prophet, playing a crucial role in the religious and political movement that Tecumseh would lead. The circumstances of Tecumseh's birth were remembered as significant by the Shawnee. According to tradition, a great meteor streaked across the sky on the night of his birth, a shooting star that seemed to presage the role he would play in Shawnee history. This celestial event gave him his name, Tecumseh, which in the Shawnee language referred to this panther or shooting star crossing the sky. From his earliest years, Tecumseh would have been educated in the skills, knowledge, and values essential to Shawnee life. Young boys learned by watching and imitating their fathers, uncles, and other male relatives, gradually taking on tasks of increasing complexity and importance. They learned to hunt, first with small bows and arrows, then with full-sized weapons. They learned to track animals by reading signs in the forest, to move silently through the woods, to identify edible and medicinal plants, and to understand the habits and behaviours of the many creatures with whom they shared the land. They also learned the arts of war. The Shawnee, like most indigenous peoples of eastern North America, had a warrior culture in which martial skill and courage in battle were highly valued. Young men trained with weapons, learning to use the bow and arrow, the war club, the tomahawk, and later, as these weapons became available, European firearms. They learned tactics, strategy, and the importance of discipline and courage in combat. But Tecumseh's education would have encompassed far more than practical skills. He would have learned the oral histories of his people, the stories and legends that transmitted cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. He would have learned about the social structures and obligations that bound the Shawnee people together, about the importance of generosity, hospitality, and mutual aid within the community. He would have learned about the spiritual dimensions of life, about the ceremonies and rituals that maintained harmony with the natural and supernatural worlds. Perhaps most importantly, Tecumseh would have learned about the crisis facing his people. Even as a child, he would have heard the elders speak with concern about the increasing encroachment of white settlers onto Shawnee lands, about the treaties that seemed to give away more and more territory, about the violence that erupted when native peoples tried to defend their homes and hunting grounds. This was the world into which Tecumseh was born, a world of natural abundance and spiritual richness, but also a world under siege, a world where the Shawnee way of life was increasingly threatened by forces that seemed beyond the capacity of any single village or even any single nation to resist. It was a world that would require extraordinary leaders if its peoples were to survive with their cultures and territories intact. Chapter 2. A Youth Forged in Conflict. Tecumseh's childhood and adolescence were marked by nearly constant warfare. The American Revolution, which began in 1775 when Tecumseh was approximately 7 years old, transformed the already tense situation in the Ohio Valley into open and brutal conflict. The Revolutionary War presented the Shawnee and other Ohio Valley nations with a difficult choice. Both the British and the American rebels sought indigenous allies, offering gifts, trade goods, and promises of support in exchange for military assistance. For the Shawnee, the choice was perhaps less difficult than it might seem. The American colonists were the ones pushing relentlessly westward onto Shawnee lands, building farms and settlements in territories that had been guaranteed to indigenous peoples by various treaties. The British, whatever their faults, at least maintained a policy of attempting to regulate and limit westward expansion. Consequently, most Shawnee communities sided with the British during the Revolutionary War, as did many other indigenous nations in the region. Shawnee warriors conducted raids against American settlements in Kentucky and western Virginia, attacking isolated homesteads and small settlements in an attempt to discourage further expansion into their territories. These raids were often brutal, involving the killing of settlers and the taking of captives, and they provoked equally brutal retaliation from American militia forces. Tecumseh's father, Pucashinwa, was an active participant in these conflicts. In 1774, he had fought in what became known as Lord Dunmore's War, a conflict between Virginia militia forces and a coalition of Shawnee and Mingo warriors. At the Battle of Point Pleasant, fought on October 10th of that year along the banks of the Ohio River, Puckashinwau and hundreds of other warriors engaged a force of Virginia militiamen in a day-long battle that resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. 2 years later, in 1776, when Tecumseh was approximately 8 years old, Puckashinwau was killed in a skirmish with American forces. The loss of his father was a formative event in young Tecumseh's life. According to later accounts, as Puckashinwau lay dying from his wounds, he made his oldest son, Tippecanoe, promise to ensure that Tecumseh was raised as a warrior and never made peace with the Americans who were invading Shawnee lands. This promise would prove to be a defining element of Tecumseh's life and character. His older brother Tippecanoe, approximately 10 years Tecumseh's senior, took seriously the responsibility of guiding his younger brother's development. Tippecanoe was already an accomplished warrior, respected for his skills in combat and his strategic thinking. He became not just a brother to Tecumseh, but also a mentor, teacher, and role model. Under Tippecanoe's guidance, Tecumseh developed the skills that would later make him one of the most formidable warriors and military leaders of his generation. He learned to shoot with exceptional accuracy, to move through the forest with stealth and speed, to read the landscape for tactical advantages, and to lead men in combat. But perhaps more importantly, he learned the values and personal qualities that would later define his leadership: courage in the face of danger, coolness under pressure, concern for the welfare of those under his command, and an absolute unwavering commitment to the defense of Shawnee lands and the Shawnee way of life. The Revolutionary War years were devastating for the Shawnee communities in Ohio. American forces, militia, and regular Continental Army units alike conducted repeated expeditions into Shawnee territory, burning villages, destroying crops, and killing or scattering the inhabitants. The goal of these expeditions was not just military defeat of the Shawnee warriors, but the destruction of the Shawnee economic base, making it impossible for them to continue their resistance. In 1778, when Tecumseh was approximately 10 years old, an American force under General Lachlan McIntosh built Fort Lawrence deep in Shawnee territory. Though the fort was eventually abandoned due to supply difficulties and native attacks, its construction demonstrated American determination to project military power into the Ohio country. The following year, 1779, saw even more destructive expeditions. In the spring, Colonel John Bowman led a force of 300 Kentucky militiamen in an attack on the Shawnee town of Chillicothe. Though the Shawnee warriors successfully defended the town and drove off the attackers, the battle demonstrated the vulnerability of even major Shawnee settlements to American military power. For young Tecumseh, these were not distant historical events, but immediate personal experiences. He would have witnessed the burning of homes, the destruction of food stores, the flight of his community from advancing enemy forces. He would have known hunger when crops were destroyed before they could be harvested. He would have experienced the grief of losing friends and relatives to battle and disease. These childhood experiences, traumatic and formative, instilled in him a fierce determination to resist American expansion and protect what remained of Shawnee territory. According to later accounts, Tecumseh participated in his first battle when he was approximately 14 years old. The engagement was a skirmish with American frontiersmen, and by some accounts, the young Tecumseh panicked and fled when the shooting began. This episode, whether true or embellished in later retellings, was said to have filled Tecumseh with shame. He reportedly vowed never again to show fear in battle, a vow he apparently kept throughout his subsequent military career. The end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 brought no peace to the Ohio Valley. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the war between Britain and the United States, ceded British claims to the lands south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River to the new American nation. Crucially, this treaty was negotiated without the participation or consent of the indigenous nations who actually inhabited and controlled most of this territory. The British, in effect, gave away lands that were not theirs to give, ignoring the claims and rights of their former native allies. The Shawnee and other Ohio Valley nations refused to accept this arrangement. From their perspective, they had not been defeated in the war, they had not signed any treaty ceding their lands, and they had no intention of allowing American settlement of their territories. The stage was set for continued and escalating conflict. Throughout the 1780s, the frontier between American settlement and indigenous territory was a zone of almost constant low-level warfare. Shawnee warriors conducted raids into Kentucky, attacking settlements and travelers. American militia forces retaliated by attacking Shawnee villages in Ohio. Both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were sometimes tortured and killed. Non-combatants, including women, children, and the elderly, were killed in attacks on villages and settlements. It was a brutal, bitter conflict that left deep scars on both indigenous and settler communities. During this period, Tecumseh participated in numerous skirmishes and battles, gaining experience and reputation as a warrior. His older brother Tecumseh remained his primary mentor and companion, and the two fought together in many engagements. Tecumseh demonstrated not just courage and skill in combat, but also leadership abilities and a talent for tactics and strategy that marked him as someone likely to rise to positions of authority within the Shawnee military structure. One incident from this period, recounted in later biographies, though difficult to verify with certainty, gives insight into Tecumseh's character and the values he held even as a young man. According to this account, Tecumseh witnessed the torture of an American prisoner by Shawnee warriors. The practice of torturing captives was not uncommon among indigenous peoples of the region, nor was it unknown among frontier Americans. It served multiple purposes: revenge for losses suffered, demonstration of warrior courage and endurance, and intimidation of enemies. But according to the story, Tecumseh was revolted by the spectacle. He is said to have spoken out against the practice, arguing that such treatment of prisoners was beneath the dignity of Shawnee warriors and inconsistent with the values of courage and honor that should guide their conduct. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as later described is uncertain, but it is consistent with Tecumseh's later documented opposition to the torture and killing of prisoners and non-combatants, a stance that set him apart from many of his contemporaries on both sides of the conflict. In 1788, when Tecumseh was approximately 20 years old, he and Tecumseh decided to leave Ohio temporarily and travel south to participate in conflicts involving the Cherokee and Creek nations. This journey, which would last several years, was a formative experience for the young Tecumseh. The southeastern indigenous nations were engaged in their own struggles against American expansion. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw peoples controlled large territories in what are now the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. These nations had developed complex political systems, some adopting certain elements of European American culture while maintaining their distinct indigenous identities. They too faced relentless pressure from American settlers and speculators seeking their lands. Tecumseh and Tippecanoe travelled among these nations, participating in raids and skirmishes against American settlements and military forces in the region. For Tecumseh, this journey provided several important experiences and lessons. First, he saw firsthand that the struggle of the Shawnee was part of a much larger pattern affecting indigenous peoples across the continent. Everywhere, native nations faced similar pressures, similar threats, similar choices between resistance and accommodation. Second, he observed the devastating effects of disunity among indigenous peoples. The southeastern nations, despite their common predicament, did not present a united front against American expansion. Internal divisions, long-standing rivalries between different peoples, and disagreements over how to respond to the American threat weakened their collective ability to resist. Some leaders advocated negotiation and accommodation, hoping to preserve at least some of their territory and autonomy through treaties with the American government. Others called for resistance and war. These divisions allowed American officials to play different groups against each other, securing land cessions from one group while promising protection against others. Third, and perhaps most tragically, Tecumseh lost his brother and mentor during this southern journey. In 1792, Tippecanoe was killed in a battle against American forces in what is now Tennessee. Tecumseh, now approximately 24 years old, had lost the guiding figure who had shaped his development from childhood. The loss was devastating, but it also marked a transition. Tecumseh was no longer a young warrior following his older brother's lead. He was now a mature warrior and emerging leader in his own right, responsible for making his own decisions and charting his own course. Tecumseh returned to Ohio in 1792 or early 1793, coming back to a situation that had deteriorated even further during his absence. The American government, under President George Washington, had launched a major military campaign to break indigenous resistance in the Ohio country once and for all. Chapter 3: The Struggle for the Ohio Country. The early 1790s marked a critical period in the struggle for control of the Ohio Valley. The United States government, frustrated by years of indigenous resistance to American settlement and determined to open the region for expansion, committed substantial military resources to defeating the Confederacy of indigenous nations that controlled the territory. The indigenous resistance was formidable. The Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Wyandot, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and other nations had formed a loose confederation, sometimes called the Western Confederacy, dedicated to preventing American expansion north of the Ohio River. This confederacy had achieved significant military successes against American forces in the late 1780s. In 1790, an American army commanded by General Josiah Harmar had been ambushed and defeated by Confederacy warriors near the Miami villages in what is now northeastern Indiana. Over 200 American soldiers and militiamen were killed in the engagement, and the survivors were forced to retreat in disorder. The victory demonstrated that indigenous forces, when well led and fighting on familiar terrain, could defeat even substantial American military expeditions. The following year, 1791, saw an even more devastating American defeat. General Arthur St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory and commander of a new expedition into indigenous territory, led an army of approximately 1,400 soldiers and militiamen north from Fort Washington, located at present-day Cincinnati. The force was poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and led by officers of questionable competence. On November 4th, 1791, St. Clair's force was encamped near the headwaters of the Wabash River when it was attacked at dawn by a force of approximately 1,000 warriors led by the Miami war chief Little Turtle and the Shawnee chief Blue Jacket. The attack was devastating. The American troops, surprised and disorganized, were unable to form effective defensive positions. Warriors infiltrated the American camp, firing from behind trees and rocks while remaining largely protected from American return fire. The battle lasted approximately 3 hours and resulted in one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the United States Army. Over 600 American soldiers were killed and nearly 300 more were wounded. The survivors, including the wounded General St. Clair, fled south in panic, abandoning their artillery, supplies, and wounded comrades who could not be moved. The indigenous casualties, by contrast, were relatively light, perhaps 60 warriors killed and a similar number wounded. The news of St. Clair's defeat shocked the American public and the Washington administration. It demonstrated that the indigenous Confederacy was not only capable of defending its territory, but could inflict catastrophic defeats on American military forces. In the aftermath of the disaster, there were calls in Congress to abandon efforts to occupy the Ohio country and to negotiate a boundary that would recognize indigenous control of the region north of the Ohio River. But President Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, were determined to continue the campaign. They recognized that control of the Ohio country was essential to American westward expansion, and that failure to subdue indigenous resistance would encourage separatist sentiments in the western territories and states. Washington appointed a new commander, General Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War veteran known for his aggressive tactics and thorough approach to military preparation. Wayne, nicknamed Mad Anthony for his boldness in combat, spent nearly 2 years preparing his army before marching into indigenous territory. Unlike his predecessors, Wayne insisted on thorough training for his troops. He drilled them relentlessly in battlefield maneuvers, marksmanship, and camp security. He took care to ensure adequate supplies and reliable logistics. He built a series of fortifications as his army advanced northward, creating secure bases and supply depots that would make it difficult for indigenous forces to cut his supply lines or force a precipitate retreat. By 1794, Wayne felt his army, which he called the Legion of the United States, was ready to take the field. That summer, he marched north from Fort Washington with approximately 3,000 soldiers, moving methodically into the heart of indigenous territory. The Confederacy leaders recognized the threat that Wayne's well-prepared and well-supplied army posed. They gathered their warriors, numbering perhaps 1,300 to 1,500 men, near a site along the Maumee River where a tornado had recently felled many trees, creating a natural defensive position of fallen timber. The location, ever after known as Fallen Timbers, seemed an ideal place to ambush Wayne's army. On August 20th, 1794, Wayne's scouts reported the presence of the indigenous force at Fallen Timbers. Wayne immediately ordered his army to attack. The warriors, positioned among the fallen trees, initially inflicted significant casualties on the advancing American infantry. But Wayne had prepared for precisely this kind of engagement. He ordered a cavalry charge that flanked the indigenous position, forcing the warriors to withdraw to avoid being surrounded. His infantry, better disciplined and better supplied with ammunition than the troops who had fought under Harmar and St. Clair, maintained steady fire and advanced relentlessly despite taking casualties. The battle lasted little more than an hour. The indigenous warriors, faced with Wayne's flanking maneuver and running low on ammunition, were forced to retreat. They withdrew toward the British Fort Miami, located nearby, hoping that the British garrison would provide support or at least refuge. But the British commander, unwilling to risk war between Britain and the United States, kept the fort gates closed and refused to allow the warriors to enter. This British betrayal was a devastating blow to indigenous morale and to the Confederacy's strategic position. The warriors had fought as allies of the British, believing that in a crisis British support would be forthcoming. The closed gates of Fort Miami demonstrated that the British were unwilling to risk their own interests to support their indigenous allies. It was a lesson that would not be forgotten. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was not, in purely military terms, a catastrophic defeat for the indigenous Confederacy. Casualties on both sides were relatively light compared to the earlier battles of the campaign. But the psychological and political effects were profound. Wayne followed up his victory by systematically destroying indigenous villages and crops throughout the region. His troops burned Shawnee, Delaware, and Miami towns, destroyed thousands of acres of corn, and drove the surviving inhabitants from their homes as winter approached. With their villages destroyed, their British allies having abandoned them, and facing starvation and exposure as winter approached, the Confederacy leaders had little choice but to negotiate. In the summer of 1795, representatives of the various nations gathered at Fort Greenville, Wayne's headquarters in western Ohio, to negotiate a peace treaty. The Treaty of Greenville, signed on August 3rd, 1795, was a disaster for the indigenous peoples of Ohio. The treaty required them to cede approximately 2/3 of what is now the state of Ohio, along with portions of present-day Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. It established a new boundary line, running roughly from the mouth of the Kentucky River on the Ohio River, northward and westward to Fort Recovery, then northward to the headwaters of the Wabash River, then to Fort Wayne, then northward to the Maumee River and along that river to Lake Erie. All lands south and east of this line were ceded to the United States. The treaty also established several specific parcels of land at strategic locations, including sites for American military posts that were ceded to the United States. In exchange, the United States government promised that the lands northwest of the treaty line would remain indigenous territory and that no American citizens would be permitted to settle on them without specific permission of the indigenous nations. The government also promised to provide annual payments in goods to the various nations that had signed the treaty, a form of compensation for the lands ceded. 12 indigenous nations signed the Treaty of Greenville, including the Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Wyandotte, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and others. Many of the most important war leaders, including Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, affixed their marks to the document, acknowledging defeat and accepting the new territorial arrangements. But Tecumseh, who was approximately 27 years old at the time, refused to attend the treaty negotiations or to accept the legitimacy of the treaty. From his perspective, no collection of chiefs, however distinguished, had the right to cede lands that belonged to all indigenous peoples collectively. Land, in Tecumseh's view, was not the property of any individual or even any specific nation that could be sold or given away. It was a common inheritance, held in trust for future generations, and no one generation had the right to alienate it. This belief in the common ownership of land by all indigenous peoples would become the cornerstone of Tecumseh's later political vision. It set him apart from many other indigenous leaders of his time, who, whether from pragmatism, despair, or genuine belief, had accepted the American practice of treating land as something that could be bought and sold through treaties negotiated with specific indigenous nations. For Tecumseh, the Treaty of Greenville was not a legitimate agreement, but a coerced surrender imposed on desperate peoples by a more powerful enemy. He refused to be bound by it and resolved to resist any further land cessions by force if necessary. This stance, principled but also potentially catastrophic in its implications, would define the remainder of his life and set him on a collision course with the growing power of the United States. In the years immediately following the Treaty of Greenville, Tecumseh's life entered a period about which relatively little is known with certainty. He was not yet a principal chief or widely recognized leader beyond his own community. He lived quietly, by his standards, in Shawnee villages in what is now western Ohio. He hunted, participated in community life, and gradually built a reputation as a man of integrity, courage, and wisdom. According to some accounts, Tecumseh married during this period, though details about his marital life are scarce and sometimes contradictory in the historical record. Some sources suggest he married a Shawnee woman named Mamate and had a son, though his marriage apparently did not last, possibly ending in divorce or separation, which was not uncommon in Shawnee society. Other sources mention different names and different children, but the fragmentary and sometimes unreliable nature of the documentation makes it impossible to reconstruct his personal life with confidence. What is clearer is that during this period, Tecumseh was thinking deeply about the crisis facing indigenous peoples and beginning to formulate the vision that would later drive his efforts to create a Pan-Indian Confederacy. He watched as more and more American settlers crossed the Greenville Treaty line, squatting on lands that were supposed to remain indigenous territory. He saw American officials pressure indigenous leaders to sign new treaties, ceding more land. He observed the corrosive effects of alcohol, which American traders provided generously and which was destroying individuals, families, and whole communities. He also paid attention to the political and diplomatic maneuverings of the various indigenous nations and the United States government. He noted how American officials exploited divisions among indigenous peoples, signing treaties with leaders who lacked genuine authority to speak for their peoples, offering bribes to corrupt chiefs, and using the threat of military force to coerce land cessions. He recognized that the strategy that had worked for the Americans in the past, dividing indigenous nations and conquering them piecemeal, would continue to work unless indigenous peoples could achieve genuine unity. But how could such unity be achieved? The indigenous nations of the eastern woodlands spoke different languages, had different cultural traditions, different political systems, different historical relationships with each other. Some had been enemies for generations. How could they be brought together in a common cause? Tecumseh believed that the answer lay in recognizing that the threat they all faced was greater than any of their traditional rivalries. American expansion threatened all of them equally. Unless they could set aside their differences and present a united front, they would all eventually suffer the same fate, losing their lands and being pushed westward into territories already occupied by other indigenous peoples, or onto reservations where they would be dependent on American government support and subject to American government control. This vision of Pan-Indian unity would become Tecumseh's life's work, but vision alone was not enough. To succeed, he would need a movement, followers committed to his cause, and a message powerful enough to overcome generations of division and distrust. He would find the foundation for such a movement in an unexpected place, in the religious visions and teachings of his younger brother, who would transform himself from a dissolute drunkard into a prophet claiming direct revelation from the Master of Life. Chapter 4: The Prophet and the Vision. Tecumseh's younger brother, born around 1775 and originally named Lalawethica, seemed an unlikely figure to spark a religious and political revolution. As a young man, Lalawethica was known as something of a failure and an embarrassment. He had lost an eye in a hunting accident, which left him with a disfiguring appearance and undermined his status in a warrior culture that valued physical perfection and martial prowess. He showed little talent for hunting or warfare. He drank heavily, was prone to boasting and lying, and was generally regarded as a person of little account within Shawnee society. But in 1805, when Lalawethica was approximately 30 years old, he underwent a dramatic transformation. According to his later accounts, he fell into a deep trance that those around him believed was death. As his relatives prepared his body for burial, he suddenly revived, claiming to have experienced a profound vision in which he had journeyed to the afterlife and received a revelation from the Master of Life. In this vision, Lalawethica said, he had seen two paths in the afterlife, one leading to a paradise reserved for those who had lived virtuously according to traditional indigenous values, and another leading to a place of torment for those who had adopted the evil practices of the whites or otherwise violated the teachings of the Master of Life. He claimed that the Master of Life had given him a mission to call indigenous peoples back to their traditional ways and to warn them against the corrupting influences of European American culture. Lalawethica changed his name to Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door, or he opens the door, signifying his role as a spiritual intermediary between the indigenous peoples and the divine. He began preaching a message of religious and cultural renewal, calling on indigenous peoples to reject the destructive aspects of white culture while returning to traditional practices and values. Tenskwatawa's teachings addressed many of the social problems that were devastating indigenous communities. He preached absolute abstinence from alcohol, recognizing that drinking was destroying individuals and families. He called for a rejection of European trade goods, urging people to return to traditional crafts and technologies. He opposed intermarriage with whites and the adoption of white cultural practices, arguing that these represented a dangerous dilution of indigenous identity and values. But Tenskwatawa's message was not simply conservative or backward-looking. He also preached a radical reconceptualization of indigenous identity and unity. He taught that the Master of Life had created indigenous peoples separately from whites, and that they were meant to live in different ways. Whites, Tenskwatawa said, were children of the Great Serpent, an evil being, while Indians were the children of the Master of Life. The two races could not successfully mix, and indigenous peoples could only prosper by maintaining their separate identity and rejecting white influences. Crucially, Tenskwatawa also taught that all indigenous peoples, regardless of which specific nation they belonged to, were fundamentally one people in the eyes of the Master of Life. Tribal and national divisions, he suggested, were less important than the fundamental unity of all indigenous peoples. This teaching provided a religious and ideological foundation for the kind of Pan-Indian political unity that Tecumseh envisioned. Tenskwatawa's message spread rapidly through indigenous communities in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. He attracted followers from various nations, people desperate for answers to the crisis facing their communities and hungry for a message of hope and renewal. By 1806, Tenskwatawa had established himself as a figure of major religious significance, attracting pilgrimages from indigenous peoples across the Great Lakes region. Tecumseh immediately recognized the potential of his brother's religious movement. While there is no evidence that Tecumseh himself underwent any dramatic religious conversion, or that he fully accepted all of his brother's teachings, he saw clearly that Tenskwatawa's message could provide the ideological foundation for the Pan-Indian political and military alliance he had been envisioning. The two brothers began working together, with Tenskwatawa providing the religious message and spiritual authority, while Tecumseh provided the political vision and military leadership. It was a powerful combination. Tenskwatawa's teachings gave people a reason to come together, a shared religious framework that transcended tribal boundaries. Tecumseh then worked to transform this religious movement into a political and military confederacy capable of resisting American expansion. In 1808, the brothers established a new village called Prophetstown at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in what is now Indiana. The location was carefully chosen. It was in territory that was relatively distant from American settlements, offering some security from immediate American interference. It was also centrally located for the various indigenous nations of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions, making it accessible to potential followers from many different peoples. Prophetstown quickly grew into a major indigenous settlement, attracting followers from the Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Wyandot, Kickapoo, and other nations. At its peak, it may have had a population of 1,000 or more people, making it one of the largest indigenous settlements in the region. It served multiple purposes. It was a religious center where Tenskwatawa preached and conducted ceremonies. It was a political center where Tecumseh met with leaders from various nations to discuss strategy and build alliances. And it was a military base where warriors gathered and trained for the conflict that many believed was inevitable. The growth of Prophetstown and the increasing influence of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa alarmed American officials, particularly William Henry Harrison, who had been appointed governor of the Indiana Territory in 1801. Harrison was an ambitious and capable administrator, charged with the task of acquiring as much indigenous land as possible for American settlement. He quickly recognized that Tecumseh's growing influence and his opposition to land cessions posed a major obstacle to American expansion. Harrison pursued a strategy of negotiating treaties with individual indigenous nations, often with leaders who had questionable authority to speak for their peoples, and offering gifts and bribes to secure land cessions. Between 1802 and 1809, Harrison negotiated a series of treaties that ceded millions of acres of indigenous territory in present-day Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin to the United States. Tecumseh bitterly opposed these treaties, arguing that they were illegitimate and would not be honored by the Confederacy he was building. He insisted that land belonged to all indigenous peoples in common, and that no single nation or group of chiefs had the authority to sell it. This put him in direct conflict not only with American officials like Harrison, but also with those indigenous leaders who believed that accommodation and negotiation with the Americans offered the best chance for survival. The crisis came to a head with the Treaty of Fort Wayne, signed in September 1809. This treaty, negotiated by Harrison with representatives of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Delaware nations, ceded approximately 3 million acres of land in present-day Indiana to the United States. The land included prime hunting territory used by many indigenous nations, and the cession directly threatened the food security and economic viability of those who depended on the region for hunting and gathering. Tecumseh was outraged. He declared the treaty invalid and warned that any attempt by Americans to occupy the ceded lands would be resisted by force. In August 1810, Tecumseh travelled to Vincennes, Harrison's territorial capital, to confront the governor directly. The meeting between Tecumseh and Harrison in August 1810 was a dramatic confrontation between two strong-willed and intelligent leaders representing fundamentally incompatible visions for the future of the region. The encounter, witnessed by numerous observers and documented in contemporary accounts, gives us our most detailed picture of Tecumseh's character, his rhetorical abilities, and his political vision. Tecumseh arrived in Vincennes with several hundred warriors, a show of force designed to demonstrate the military power of his confederacy. Harrison, alarmed by this display, met with Tecumseh in an outdoor venue where both men could be accompanied by armed followers. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides prepared for violence if the negotiations broke down. Speaking through interpreters, Tecumseh delivered a lengthy address in which he laid out his position. He began by recounting the history of indigenous American relations, detailing the many treaties that had been violated, the promises that had been broken, the lands that had been taken through fraud and coercion. He argued that the Treaty of Fort Wayne was illegitimate because the chiefs who had signed it had no authority to sell lands that belonged to all indigenous peoples in common. Tecumseh then articulated his vision of Pan-Indian unity and common land ownership. The Master of Life, he argued, had given the land to all indigenous peoples as a common inheritance. No individual nation and no individual chief had the right to cede this common property. Only a council representing all indigenous nations, acting with genuine consensus, could legitimately negotiate away any portion of the land. He warned Harrison that the land ceded in the Treaty of Fort Wayne would not be given up peacefully. If American settlers attempted to occupy it, they would be driven off by force. He made clear that his confederacy was prepared for war, if necessary, to prevent further land cessions. Harrison responded by defending the treaty, arguing that it had been negotiated with the legitimate leaders of the nations that actually occupied and used the ceded territory. He rejected Tecumseh's claim that land was owned by all indigenous peoples in common, arguing that different nations had specific territories and that the United States government would continue to negotiate with each nation separately. The exchange became heated. At one point, Tecumseh apparently called Harrison a liar, and Harrison ordered the guards to prepare for violence. Tecumseh's warriors and Harrison's soldiers both raised their weapons, and for a moment it appeared that a battle might erupt in the heart of Vincennes. But both leaders stepped back from the brink, and the meeting adjourned without violence. The Vincennes meeting made clear that Tecumseh and Harrison represented irreconcilable positions. Harrison was determined to continue acquiring indigenous lands through treaties with individual nations. Tecumseh was equally determined to resist any further land cessions and to build a confederacy powerful enough to enforce that resistance. Both men recognized that conflict was likely inevitable. In the months following the Vincennes meeting, Tecumseh embarked on an ambitious diplomatic journey to build support for his confederacy. He traveled south, visiting the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, seeking to bring them into his alliance. He also visited indigenous communities throughout the Great Lakes region and as far west as Missouri, preaching his message of unity and resistance. This journey, which lasted many months and covered thousands of miles, demonstrated Tecumseh's commitment to his vision and his exceptional abilities as a diplomat and orator. Contemporary accounts, from both indigenous and white observers, describe him as a charismatic and compelling speaker, able to move his audiences with his eloquence and passion. He adapted his message to different audiences, sometimes emphasizing the religious teachings of his brother, sometimes focusing on the political and military necessity of unity, sometimes appealing to traditional values and ways of life that were threatened by American expansion. Tecumseh's southern journey in 1811 was particularly significant. The southern indigenous nations controlled vast territories and could field large numbers of warriors. If they joined Tecumseh's confederacy, the movement would become a truly continental force capable of challenging American expansion across a broad front. Tecumseh's message found receptive audiences among some segments of the southern nations, particularly among younger warriors and those who had suffered most directly from American encroachment. But he also faced significant opposition from leaders who believed that accommodation with the Americans was the only realistic path forward. The older chiefs of the Cherokee and Chickasaw nations in particular were skeptical of Tecumseh's vision, fearing that it would lead to a catastrophic war that indigenous peoples could not win. Among the Creek Nation, Tecumseh's message had more impact. The Creeks, or Muskogee people, were themselves divided between factions favouring accommodation with Americans, sometimes called the White Sticks, and those favouring resistance, known as the Red Sticks. Tecumseh's visit strengthened the Red Stick faction, and while the Creek Nation as a whole did not join his confederacy, many individual Creek warriors were inspired by his message to resist American expansion in their own lands. While Tecumseh was travelling in the south, building support for his confederacy, events in the north were moving toward crisis. Chapter 5. The Battle of Tippecanoe. During Tecumseh's absence on his southern diplomatic mission, his brother Tenskwatawa remained at Prophetstown, managing the growing settlement and continuing to preach his religious message. But Tenskwatawa lacked Tecumseh's political sophistication and diplomatic skills, and he would make decisions that would prove disastrous for the movement. William Henry Harrison, watching the growth of Prophetstown and the expansion of Tecumseh's influence with increasing alarm, decided that the time had come to act. In the fall of 1811, he assembled a force of approximately 1,000 soldiers, including regular U.S. Army troops and Indiana militia, and marched north toward Prophetstown. Harrison's ostensible goal was not necessarily to destroy Prophetstown, but to intimidate the inhabitants and demonstrate American military power. He may have hoped that a show of force would convince the indigenous peoples gathered there to disperse peacefully and abandon their resistance to American expansion. But he was also prepared for battle and carefully positioned his force to defend against attack. On November 6, 1811, Harrison's army encamped near Prophetstown on a small plateau near the Tippecanoe River. The location, later known as Battleground, offered reasonable defensive advantages with good fields of fire and protection from surprise attack. Harrison placed his troops in a careful defensive formation and ordered strict security measures, expecting that the warriors at Prophetstown might attempt a night attack. At Prophetstown, Tenskwatawa faced a crucial decision. Tecumseh, before leaving on his southern journey, had specifically instructed his brother to avoid military confrontation with the Americans until he returned. Tecumseh knew that his confederacy was not yet strong enough for a major war with the United States, and he wanted time to build more alliances and gather more warriors before engaging in large-scale combat. But Tenskwatawa, influenced by his role as a prophet and perhaps overconfident in the spiritual protection he believed he could provide to warriors, decided to attack Harrison's force. According to later accounts, he told the warriors that his spiritual power would protect them from American bullets, that the American gunpowder would turn to sand, and that victory was assured if they had faith in his prophecy. In the early morning hours of November 7th, approximately 500 to 600 warriors from various nations launched an attack on Harrison's encampment. The attack began just before dawn, traditionally a favourable time for such assaults, as defenders would be tired from the night watches and would not yet be fully prepared for combat. The warriors, following Tenskwatawa's guidance, attacked with confidence, expecting their spiritual protection would make them invulnerable. They struck the American perimeter at multiple points, initially achieving surprise and breaking through the American lines in several places. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted throughout the camp as warriors engaged American soldiers with war clubs and tomahawks. But Harrison's defensive preparations proved effective. His troops, though surprised and initially driven back, did not panic. Officers maintained control, troops fell back to secondary defensive positions, and the Americans' superior discipline and firepower began to tell. As dawn broke and visibility improved, American soldiers were able to deliver more effective fire, and the warriors' initial momentum stalled. The battle lasted approximately 2 hours. As it became clear that Tenskwatawa's prophecy of invulnerability was false, that American bullets were very much effective, and that warriors were dying despite their faith in spiritual protection, the attack faltered. The warriors, having suffered significant casualties and seeing their prophet's predictions proven wrong, withdrew from the battlefield and dispersed into the surrounding countryside. Harrison's troops had also suffered significant casualties, approximately 62 killed and 126 wounded. But the Americans held the field, and later that day Harrison ordered his troops to march to Prophetstown itself. Finding the settlement largely abandoned, Harrison's soldiers burned the town, destroying the houses, food stores, and personal possessions of the inhabitants. Prophetstown, the physical centre of Tecumseh's movement, was destroyed. The Battle of Tippecanoe was not a major military engagement by the standards of European warfare, involving relatively small numbers of combatants and resulting in relatively limited casualties. But its political and psychological effects were profound and devastating for Tecumseh's Confederacy. Tenskwatawa's credibility as a prophet was shattered. His promises of spiritual protection had proven false, and warriors had died because they believed his assurances of invulnerability. Many of those who had gathered at Prophetstown, already uncertain about the wisdom of confronting American military power, now returned to their home villages, disillusioned and convinced that the Confederacy could not protect them. Tenskwatawa himself became a figure of ridicule and contempt. Where he had once been revered as a spiritual leader with direct access to divine wisdom, he was now seen as a charlatan whose false prophecies had led men to their deaths. His influence over the movement evaporated almost overnight. For Tecumseh, who was still in the south when news of the battle reached him, the disaster was both personal and political. His brother had disobeyed his explicit instructions and had squandered much of what Tecumseh had spent years building. The physical centre of the movement was destroyed, many followers had dispersed, and the Confederacy's credibility and momentum were severely damaged. Tecumseh returned north to find his movement in disarray. But he was not defeated, and he immediately set about trying to rebuild and salvage what he could from the wreckage of Tippecanoe. He worked to reassure and rally his remaining followers, arguing that the battle had been lost because of Tenskwatawa's premature action, not because the cause itself was wrong or because resistance was futile. But the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The Battle of Tippecanoe occurred in November 1811. Within months, the deteriorating relationship between the United States and Great Britain would explode into open warfare, the War of 1812. This new conflict would create both opportunities and dangers for Tecumseh and his Confederacy. Chapter 6. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain had multiple causes, rooted in disputes over maritime rights, territorial ambitions, and unresolved tensions left over from the American Revolution. For Tecumseh and the indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions, the war represented both an opportunity and a final desperate chance to preserve their lands and independence. The causes of the war were complex. The British, engaged in a life-or-death struggle against Napoleonic France, had imposed blockades and trade restrictions that hurt American commerce. The Royal Navy had also engaged in impressment, forcibly recruiting American sailors to serve on British warships, a practice that the United States government found intolerable. There were also American territorial ambitions, with some American politicians and military leaders seeing war as an opportunity to conquer Canada and perhaps drive the British from North America entirely. For indigenous peoples, British support represented perhaps their last hope of resisting American expansion. The British, though they had betrayed their indigenous allies after the Revolutionary War and again at Fort Miami after Fallen Timbers, were still seen as potentially useful allies against the Americans. British officials in Canada, recognizing that Indigenous warriors could be valuable allies in defending Canada against American invasion, were willing to provide military support, weapons, and supplies to Indigenous resistance movements. Tecumseh saw the approaching war as an opportunity to rebuild his Confederacy and strike a decisive blow against American expansion. If the British and Indigenous forces could defeat the Americans, it might be possible to establish an Indigenous homeland in the Great Lakes region, protected by British treaty guarantees and strong enough to defend itself against future American encroachment. In the months leading up to the formal declaration of war in June 1812, Tecumseh worked to rebuild his Confederacy and establish an alliance with the British. He met with British officials in Canada, securing promises of military support and supplies. He travelled among Indigenous communities, rallying warriors and building support for coordinated military action against the Americans once war began. When war was declared on June 18, 1812, Tecumseh was ready. He gathered several hundred warriors and joined forces with British troops in Canada under the command of General Isaac Brock. Brock, a capable and aggressive British officer, immediately recognized Tecumseh's abilities and the value of Indigenous support in the coming campaign. The relationship between Tecumseh and Brock was one of mutual respect and understanding. According to later accounts, Brock was impressed by Tecumseh's intelligence, his military capabilities, and his personal dignity and bearing. He reportedly said of Tecumseh that he was a great warrior and treated him not as a subordinate, but as an allied commander, deserving of respect and consultation. For his part, Tecumseh appreciated Brock's willingness to listen to Indigenous concerns and to coordinate military operations in ways that served both British and Indigenous interests. Unlike many European officers who dismissed Indigenous warriors as unreliable or savage, Brock recognized their military value and integrated them effectively into his forces. The first major military operation of the war in the Western Theatre was the British and Indigenous attack on Fort Detroit. Detroit was a crucial American outpost, controlling passage between Lake Erie and Lake Huron and serving as a base for American military operations in the region. Its capture would severely weaken the American position in the Northwest and would open the way for further operations against American settlements in Ohio. The commander of the American forces at Detroit was General William Hull, the governor of Michigan Territory. Hull was elderly, indecisive, and plagued by self-doubt. He had initially led an invasion into Canada, but had quickly retreated back to Detroit when he learned of the declaration of war and feared being cut off from his supply lines. In August 1812, Brock and Tecumseh led a combined force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and Indigenous warriors, numbering perhaps 1,300 men total, to lay siege to Detroit. Hull's garrison was actually larger, numbering approximately 2,000 soldiers, and the fort's defensive position was reasonably strong. But Hull was paralysed by fear, particularly fear of Indigenous warriors and the possibility that the fort might be overrun and the garrison massacred. Tecumseh and Brock exploited this fear brilliantly. Tecumseh had his warriors march in circles through a clearing visible from the fort, making it appear that Indigenous forces were far more numerous than they actually were. Brock sent Hull a message suggesting that once battle was joined, it might be impossible to restrain the indigenous warriors from killing prisoners and civilians. This was largely a bluff, as both Tecumseh and Brock were committed to observing the rules of warfare and protecting non-combatants, but Hull did not know this. On August 16th, 1812, after only minimal fighting, Hull surrendered Detroit and his entire army to Brock and Tecumseh. It was a stunning victory, achieved largely through psychological warfare and Hull's own incompetence. The surrender gave the British control of Michigan Territory and provided a huge boost to morale for British and indigenous forces. For Tecumseh, the capture of Detroit seemed to vindicate his strategy of alliance with the British. It demonstrated that combined British and indigenous forces could defeat the Americans, and it suggested that the goal of creating a protected indigenous homeland might actually be achievable. Tragically, General Brock, Tecumseh's most capable and sympathetic British ally, was killed just 2 months later at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812. Brock's death was a significant loss for both the British war effort and for Tecumseh's Confederacy. His successors, while competent, did not have the same level of respect for indigenous allies or the same commitment to indigenous interests. Through the fall and winter of 1812 and into 1813, the war in the Northwest continued with mixed results. Indigenous warriors, fighting alongside British troops, participated in numerous engagements, including the siege of Fort Meigs in northern Ohio and various raids on American settlements. But the strategic situation was slowly shifting against the British and their indigenous allies. On Lake Erie, the Americans were building a fleet of warships designed to contest British naval superiority on the Great Lakes. In September 1813, an American fleet under Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet at the Battle of Lake Erie, giving the Americans control of the lake and cutting British supply lines to their forces in the Detroit region. The loss of Lake Erie forced the British commander in the region, General Henry Proctor, to abandon Detroit and retreat eastward toward the British supply base at Burlington on the western end of Lake Ontario. Tecumseh was furious at this decision, arguing that retreating would abandon the indigenous peoples of the region to American retribution and would undermine everything they had fought for. According to accounts from participants, Tecumseh confronted Proctor directly, accusing the British of cowardice and betrayal. In a speech to Proctor and the assembled officers and warriors, Tecumseh reportedly compared the British to a fat dog that runs away at the first sign of danger. He made clear that he and his warriors would not abandon their homeland without a fight, and he demanded that Proctor make a stand against the pursuing American forces. Reluctantly, Proctor agreed to turn and fight. In early October 1813, British troops and indigenous warriors, numbering perhaps 1,300 men total, took up a defensive position along the Thames River in what is now southern Ontario. Tecumseh personally supervised the positioning of the indigenous warriors, placing them in the woods flanking the British regulars, who were formed in a thin line across the road. On October 5th, 1813, an American army under the command of William Henry Harrison, the same Harrison who had burned Prophetstown 2 years earlier, attacked the British and indigenous position. Harrison's force numbered approximately 3,000 soldiers, including regular infantry and mounted Kentucky militia. The battle began with a cavalry charge by the mounted Kentuckians, who broke through the British line with shocking ease. The British regulars, poorly positioned and demoralised by their long retreat, offered minimal resistance before surrendering or fleeing. The entire British line collapsed within minutes. This left the indigenous warriors, positioned in the woods, fighting alone against vastly superior American forces. Tecumseh, fighting in the thick of the combat, rallied his warriors and tried to organize a coherent defense. According to various accounts, he was everywhere in the battle, encouraging his men, directing their fire, exposing himself to danger with what observers described as reckless courage. At some point during the fierce fighting in the woods, Tecumseh was killed. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain and contested. Multiple American soldiers later claimed to have killed him, but none of these claims can be verified with certainty. Some accounts suggest he was shot multiple times and fell early in the battle. Others suggest he fought on for some time, even after being mortally wounded. What is certain is that once word spread that Tecumseh had fallen, the indigenous resistance collapsed. Warriors who had been fighting desperately against overwhelming odds began to flee into the deeper woods and scatter. The battle, later known as the Battle of the Thames or the Battle of Moraviantown, was a decisive American victory. Tecumseh's body was never officially identified. American soldiers searching the battlefield found numerous indigenous dead, but Tecumseh's followers, according to indigenous accounts, had removed his body and buried it in a secret location to prevent the kind of mutilation and desecration that victorious soldiers sometimes inflicted on enemy dead. Despite many later claims and legends about the location of Tecumseh's grave, his final resting place remains unknown. Tecumseh died on October 5, 1813, at approximately age 45. With his death, the dream of a united indigenous confederacy capable of resisting American expansion effectively died as well. While the War of 1812 continued for another year and a half, and while indigenous peoples continued to resist American expansion in various ways, there would never again be a leader who could command the respect, loyalty, and following that Tecumseh had achieved. Chapter 7: Legacy and Impact. The death of Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames marked not just the end of one man's life, but the effective end of organised indigenous resistance to American expansion in the region east of the Mississippi River. In the months and years following Tecumseh's death, the military and political situation of indigenous peoples in the region deteriorated rapidly. The War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24th, 1814. The treaty essentially restored the pre-war status quo between the United States and Great Britain, with no significant territorial changes and no resolution of most of the issues that had caused the war. For indigenous peoples, the treaty was a disaster, as it included no protections for indigenous lands or recognition of indigenous sovereignty. The British, having used indigenous warriors as allies during the war, essentially abandoned them in the peace negotiations, just as they had after the Revolutionary War. In the years following the war, American settlement of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan accelerated dramatically. The indigenous peoples who remained in the region were subjected to intense pressure to cede their remaining lands and relocate west of the Mississippi River. Some resisted, leading to conflicts like the Black Hawk War of 1832, but these were ultimately futile gestures. The balance of power had shifted decisively in favour of the United States. By 1840, virtually all indigenous peoples had been removed from the states of the old Northwest Territory. The Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and other nations were relocated to reservations in Kansas, Oklahoma, and other western territories. The removal process was often brutal, involving forced marches, inadequate supplies, and terrible suffering. Many died from disease, exposure, and malnutrition during the relocations. But while Tecumseh failed in his immediate goal of preventing American expansion and preserving indigenous lands, his legacy and influence extended far beyond his own time and place. He became, and remains, one of the most celebrated and admired figures in Native American history, a symbol of resistance, dignity, and the tragic struggle of indigenous peoples against overwhelming odds. Tecumseh's reputation rests on several qualities that distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. First was his vision of Pan-Indian unity. While he was not the first indigenous leader to recognize the need for unity among different nations, he articulated this vision more clearly and pursued it more consistently than most others. His insistence that land belonged to all indigenous peoples in common and that no individual nation could legitimately cede it represented a radical challenge to both American treaty-making practices and traditional indigenous concepts of territorial sovereignty. Second was his military capability. Contemporary accounts from both allies and enemies consistently describe Tecumseh as an exceptional warrior and military leader. He demonstrated courage in battle, tactical skill, and the ability to inspire and lead men under the most difficult circumstances. His role in the capture of Detroit and his defiant stand at the Thames demonstrated these qualities clearly. Third was his moral character, particularly his opposition to the torture and killing of prisoners and non-combatants. In an era when both indigenous warriors and frontier American soldiers often engaged in atrocities, Tecumseh stood out for his insistence on humane treatment of prisoners and respect for the rules of warfare. While some of these accounts may be exaggerated or romanticized in later retellings, there is substantial contemporary evidence that Tecumseh did genuinely oppose such practices and tried to prevent them among his followers. Fourth was his oratorical ability. Multiple contemporary accounts describe Tecumseh as an exceptionally eloquent and persuasive speaker. His speeches, even in translation, apparently moved his audiences, whether indigenous warriors, British officers, or American officials. His ability to articulate his vision and inspire others to follow him was crucial to whatever success his movement achieved. Tecumseh's influence extended into the broader culture and politics of the United States as well, though in ways that would probably have dismayed him. In the decades following his death, he became a somewhat romanticized figure in American popular culture, celebrated as a noble savage, a worthy opponent who had fought bravely for his people. This romanticization, while ostensibly complimentary, often stripped Tecumseh of his actual historical complexity and political significance, reducing him to a stock character in American mythology. William Henry Harrison, who had fought against Tecumseh at Tippecanoe and the Thames, used his military victories over Tecumseh as a major selling point in his successful campaign for the presidency in 1840. Tippecanoe and Tyler too was the campaign slogan, celebrating Harrison's role in defeating indigenous resistance. The irony that Harrison's political success was built on the destruction of Tecumseh's movement and the dispossession of indigenous peoples was apparently lost on most American voters. Numerous towns, counties, and geographic features across the United States were named after Tecumseh in the 19th century, a strange form of honor for a man who had dedicated his life to resisting American expansion. The appropriation of Tecumseh's name by the very society he had fought against reflects the complex and often contradictory ways in which American culture has engaged with indigenous history. Among indigenous peoples, Tecumseh's legacy was and remains more straightforward. He is remembered as a hero, a leader who tried to unite his people against oppression and who fought with courage and dignity for a cause he believed in. His vision of Pan-Indian unity, while unrealized in his own time, would inspire later indigenous political movements, from the Red Power movement of the 1960s and 70s to contemporary efforts to build solidarity among different indigenous nations. Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, outlived him by many years but never recovered his former influence or prestige. After the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tenskwatawa was increasingly marginalized, and he eventually relocated west of the Mississippi with other removed Shawnee peoples. He died in Kansas in 1836 or 1837, a largely forgotten figure whose religious movement had briefly seemed capable of transforming indigenous resistance but had ultimately failed. The broader indigenous confederacy that Tecumseh had tried to build also disintegrated after his death. Without his leadership and unifying vision, the various nations that had participated in the movement returned to their own separate concerns and strategies for survival. Some attempted to negotiate favorable treaties with the United States, others resisted and were ultimately defeated and removed. The fundamental problem that Tecumseh had identified, the difficulty of achieving unity among diverse indigenous peoples with different languages, cultures, and interests, remained unsolved. In recent decades, historians have worked to develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of Tecumseh, moving beyond both the romanticized portrayals of earlier American popular culture and the simplified narratives that reduced him to a one-dimensional symbol. Modern scholarship has examined Tecumseh in the context of the broader indigenous experience of colonialism, the specific historical circumstances of the early 19th century, and the complex political and military challenges he faced. Some scholars have noted the paradoxes and tensions in Tecumseh's vision. His call for Pan-Indian unity based on a common indigenous identity was, in some ways, a response to and adoption of categories imposed by European colonialism. Before European contact, indigenous peoples defined themselves primarily by their specific national and clan identities, not as generically Indian. The creation of a unified indigenous identity was, in part, a response to European practices of lumping all indigenous peoples together as Indians or savages. Similarly, Tecumseh's insistence that land could not be sold or ceded was itself a response to European concepts of property ownership and sovereignty. Traditional indigenous concepts of land tenure were complex and varied, but generally emphasized use rights rather than absolute ownership. Tecumseh's argument that land belonged to all indigenous peoples in common and could not be alienated represented both a rejection of European property concepts and, ironically, an adoption of the European framework of debate about land ownership. Other scholars have examined Tecumseh's role in the War of 1812 more critically, noting that his alliance with the British was ultimately based on a misreading of British intentions and capabilities. The British were willing to use indigenous warriors as allies when it served British interests, but they were never seriously committed to creating an independent indigenous homeland in the Great Lakes region. When British interests required abandoning their indigenous allies, they did so without hesitation, as they had repeatedly in the past. Some have also questioned whether Tecumseh's military strategy was realistic. Even if the British and indigenous forces had achieved more significant victories in the War of 1812, it is unclear whether this would have resulted in lasting protection for indigenous lands and sovereignty. The fundamental disparity in population, resources, and industrial capacity between indigenous peoples and the expanding United States would likely have led to the same ultimate outcome, just delayed by a few years or decades. Yet, despite these scholarly debates and critical reassessments, Tecumseh's historical significance remains clear. He was, by any measure, one of the most important indigenous leaders in North American history. His vision of Pan-Indian unity, his military capabilities, his moral character, and his ultimate tragic failure all contributed to making him a figure of enduring historical importance. Tecumseh's life also illuminates broader themes in the history of indigenous peoples' encounter with European colonialism. His story demonstrates the devastating impact of European expansion on indigenous societies, the impossible choices that indigenous leaders faced, the courage and creativity with which many responded to those challenges, and the ultimate tragedy that even the most capable and visionary leaders could not prevent dispossession and cultural destruction when faced with the overwhelming military and demographic power of the colonizing society. Chapter 8: Reflection and Remembrance. As we near the end of our journey through Tecumseh's life, it is worth taking time to reflect on the broader meaning of his story and the lessons it might offer to those who contemplate it today, more than 2 centuries after his death. Tecumseh lived in a time of tremendous upheaval and transformation, when the indigenous peoples of eastern North America were fighting for their very survival as distinct peoples with their own lands, cultures, and ways of life. The pressure they faced was relentless and ultimately overwhelming. European American settlement, driven by a rapidly growing population and an ideology of manifest destiny that saw westward expansion as both inevitable and divinely ordained, could not be halted by military resistance alone. Yet Tecumseh refused to accept what many saw as inevitable. He believed that unity among indigenous peoples could create a force strong enough to resist American expansion, or at least to negotiate more favorable terms for indigenous survival. He dedicated his life to building that unity, traveling thousands of miles, speaking to countless audiences, fighting in numerous battles, always working toward his vision of a confederacy strong enough to preserve indigenous lands and lifeways. The fact that he ultimately failed does not diminish the significance of his effort. History is filled with noble failures, with people who fought against overwhelming odds for causes they believed in, knowing that success was uncertain, but believing that the fight itself was necessary and meaningful. Tecumseh represents this tradition of resistance in the face of impossible odds, of maintaining dignity and purpose, even when confronted with forces that cannot be defeated. His opposition to the torture and killing of prisoners, his insistence on humane conduct, even in the midst of brutal warfare, speaks to a moral core that transcended the immediate circumstances of his struggle. He recognized that how one fights is as important as what one fights for, that the methods used in pursuit of a goal can undermine or validate the goal itself. This ethical stance, maintained in an era of tremendous violence and suffering, represents one of his most admirable qualities. Tecumseh's vision of Pan-Indian unity, while unrealized in his lifetime, planted seeds that would bear fruit in later generations. The idea that indigenous peoples across different nations and linguistic groups share common interests and should work together for common goals has been a recurring theme in indigenous politics from Tecumseh's time to the dot-com's present. Modern indigenous political movements, advocacy organizations, and solidarity efforts all owe something to the vision that Tecumseh articulated and for which he fought. The tragedy of Tecumseh's story is not just his personal death on the battlefield at the Thames, but the larger tragedy of indigenous dispossession and cultural destruction that his death symbolizes. The indigenous peoples of eastern North America, who had lived on their lands for countless generations, who had developed rich and complex cultures perfectly adapted to their environments, who had their own systems of governance, spirituality, and social organization, were pushed aside to make way for a new society that saw them as obstacles to progress. This dispossession had consequences that continue to reverberate through indigenous communities today. The removal from ancestral lands, the disruption of traditional ways of life, the forced assimilation into Euro-American culture, the poverty and marginalization that resulted from losing economic self-sufficiency, all these created intergenerational trauma that affects indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada to this day. Yet, indigenous peoples have survived. Despite centuries of colonialism, warfare, forced removal, cultural suppression, and attempted assimilation, indigenous nations still exist. Indigenous cultures are still practiced. Indigenous languages are still spoken, and indigenous peoples continue to assert their rights and identities. This survival itself represents a kind of victory, a testament to the resilience and determination of peoples who refuse to disappear despite facing policies explicitly designed to eliminate them as distinct cultures. Tecumseh's story is part of this larger story of indigenous survival and resistance. He represents a moment when it seemed possible, however briefly, that indigenous peoples might successfully resist the tide of colonization and preserve their lands and ways of life. That moment passed, and the vision Tecumseh fought for was not realized in his time, but the values he represented, the courage he demonstrated, the vision he articulated, all remain as inspiration for those who continue the struggle for indigenous rights, recognition, and self-determination. For non-indigenous people who study Tecumseh's life, his story offers important lessons about the costs of colonialism and expansion, about the human consequences of policies driven by land hunger and racial ideology. It serves as a reminder that the history of North America is not simply a story of progress and expanding freedom, but also a story of conquest, dispossession, and loss. The prosperous modern societies of the United States and Canada were built, in part, on the ruins of indigenous societies that were destroyed or severely damaged to make way for European American settlement. Understanding this history, does not require wallowing in guilt or rejecting all aspects of modern North American society. But it does require honesty about the past, recognition of the injustices that were committed, and acknowledgement of the continuing effects of those historical injustices on Indigenous communities today. It requires moving beyond romanticized or simplified narratives of Indigenous history and engaging with the actual complexity and tragedy of what occurred. Tecumseh, the shooting star, the panther across the sky, lived a life of purpose and commitment to his people and his vision. He fought courageously for a cause he believed in, even when the odds against success seemed overwhelming. He maintained his moral principles even in the midst of brutal warfare. He worked tirelessly to unite divided peoples in common cause. And he died in battle, still fighting, still resisting, still refusing to accept what others saw as inevitable. His grave is unmarked and unknown. His confederacy did not survive him. His people were driven from their lands within a generation of his death. Yet his memory survives, and his story continues to inspire those who learn it. He represents the best of what leadership can be: courage, vision, integrity, and commitment to a cause larger than oneself. He also represents the tragedy of peoples caught in the path of forces they could not control, whose best efforts could not prevent catastrophe. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will carry with you some images from Tecumseh's life. The forests and rivers of 18th century Ohio, abundant with game and still controlled by the peoples who had lived there for countless generations. The young Tecumseh, learning the skills of a warrior from his older brother, growing in capability and confidence. The mature Tecumseh travelling thousands of miles, speaking to diverse audiences, working to build the unity he believed could save his people. The warrior Tecumseh at the Thames, fighting to the end, refusing to surrender or flee, even when all hope was lost. These images, and the story they tell, are part of the complex and often painful history of this continent. They remind us that the landscape we inhabit today has its own history, that the forests we walk through and the rivers we cross have witnessed events of tremendous significance, that the seemingly peaceful and prosperous modern world was built on foundations that include violence, displacement, and loss. But they also remind us of human qualities that transcend any particular time or place: courage, integrity, dedication to a cause, love for one's people and homeland, the willingness to fight for what one believes is right, even when success seems impossible. These qualities, embodied in Tecumseh's life, speak to something fundamental in the human spirit: a refusal to submit passively to forces we believe are unjust, a commitment to resist even when resistance seems futile. And so we remember Tecumseh not just as a historical figure from the early 19th century, but as a symbol of resistance, dignity, and the tragic struggle of peoples fighting to preserve what they held most dear. We remember his vision of unity, his courage in battle, his moral integrity, and his ultimate sacrifice. We remember the world he tried to preserve and the peoples he tried to unite. And we reflect on what was lost when his vision failed and his confederacy collapsed, when the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands were driven from their ancestral lands and forced to begin new lives in unfamiliar territories far from the graves of their ancestors. This is the story of Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who became a symbol for all indigenous peoples fighting against the tide of colonization. It is a story of vision and failure, of courage and tragedy, of a man who fought against impossible odds for a cause he believed in with all his heart. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not as a comfortable myth or a simplified fable, but in all its complexity and pain, as a reminder of the real costs of the history that shaped the world we live in today. As we close this extended exploration of Tecumseh's life and legacy, may his memory serve as both an inspiration and a warning. An inspiration to those who fight for justice and resist oppression, who refuse to accept what others say is inevitable, who maintain their integrity and principles even in the most difficult circumstances. And a warning about the costs of conquest and colonization, about the human consequences of policies driven by greed and racial superiority, about what is lost when peoples and cultures are destroyed in the name of progress and civilization. Tecumseh's shooting star blazed across the sky of early 19th century North America, bright and fierce and beautiful, before falling to earth on a battlefield far from his birthplace. But the light of that star still reaches us across more than 2 centuries of history, illuminating a life lived with purpose and passion, a struggle fought with courage and determination, and a vision that, though unrealized in its time, continues to inspire those who learn of it today. Rest now, and may your dreams be filled with the forests and rivers of a world that once was, the voices of peoples long since dispersed, the echoes of battles fought and speeches delivered, the memory of a man who refused to surrender his people's future without a fight. This has been Sleepless History, and this has been the story of Tecumseh.